Welcome to week 3 of the course. So you will, under the contents section, you'll see the assignments for week 3, and within the folder there will also be PDFs of the readings. So one thing real quick, your BLAST nonfiction piece is due on August 30th, which is coming up in a few days. And just submit that, email that to me as a file attachment. I would also make sure that within the file itself that your name is on that, so that if I do lose that file some way, at least I'll be able to sort it out and figure out whose it is. So one other thing is I've opened up a discussion board, which is titled Drafts of the BLAST Nonfiction piece. So if you want to post a draft of your BLAST nonfiction piece there for quick feedback, I will do my best to get around to all of them, and hopefully your classmates will go in and give you some feedback too. So I hope that BLAST nonfiction piece is going to be fun. It will certainly be a way for us to get started. In terms of the readings for this week, we'll be reading Scott Russell Sanders, The Singular First Person. This is another personal essay about the personal essay, similar to Madden. So I hope that this will give you a little more of a feel for the genre of the personal essay. Also, you'll be reading Janet Wonder's Cleaning Theory. I think this is a really excellent example of how you can write about something that is not dramatic or tragic or historical in import, and do a very good piece of writing about it. So it's an example of what Madden's talking about with writing about the quotidian. It's also a very good example of how personal essays are often structured. So it's not necessarily, or quite often, not a narrative structure. It's a matter of you start thinking through a topic and you follow your line of thought. So the line of thought itself becomes the structure of the essay. So I would watch for that as you're reading Wonder's essay. You'll also notice that there's a piece by Philip Lopate on the necessity of turning oneself into a character. Our next project will be to do a character sketch, but we're going to do it in a short version and a long version. But the Lopate article should help to give you a little bit of a sense of how to go about doing a character sketch. And one of the things I would watch for as you're reading nonfiction is how other authors are doing character sketches. Because you'll see a fair amount of variation there. But this is another one of the little contradictions in creative nonfiction. When you're writing about yourself, you might think, well, I'm not a character in the way that a person in a piece of fiction is a character. I'm a real person. But you still have to create your character on the page. Sometimes that character is just a narrative voice, so it's an ethos kind of issue. Sometimes that character is an earlier version of yourself. Sometimes it's somebody that you know, but you have to remember that even though that's a real person, the reader does not know that person. So the reader is going to have to start getting a handle on what that character is. And just, I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to how I view character sketches. Here's what I try to think of when I'm doing a character sketch is that I try to give a very quick handle or hook for the reader to think about that character. And it might be some little quirky thing. It might be the person's speech or something odd about his or her looks or something definitive about how the person moves or the physical appearance of the person. But you need to have some sort of little hook for saying this is who that person is. And then you can, as the work progresses, you can build that character and make it more complex. But for the initial impression of the character, we need something that's very simple and memorable that we can latch onto. I'm going to read also just a real quick paragraph or two from Philip Lopate's book, To Show and to Tell. Here we go again. It's one of the better books on the craft of doing creative nonfiction. But there's one paragraph that I was going to read to you, which talks a little bit about the what Bakhtin would call the double voicedness of narration. So what Lopate is talking about is that there are going to be multiple voices quite often, which means also multiple characters in a piece of nonfiction. So if you're doing a memoir, for example, you may be writing about your younger self and you may need to create that kind of character and that kind of voice. But you're also going to have the more mature, older narrative voice that is reflecting back on that. So that's what he's talking about in this paragraph, which I'll try to run through fairly quickly. In writing memoir, the trick, it seems to me, is to establish a double perspective that will allow the reader to participate vicariously in the experience as it was lived, the child's confusion and misapprehension, say, while benefiting from the sophisticated wisdom of the author's adult self. The second perspective, which takes advantage of a more mature intelligence to interpret the past, is not merely an obligation, but a privilege and an opportunity. In any autobiographical narrative, whether memoir or personal essay, the marrow often shows itself in these moments where the author analyzes the meaning of his or her experience. The quality of thinking, the depth of insight, and the willingness to wrest as much understanding as one is humanly capable of arriving at. These are the guarantees to the reader that a particular author's sensibility is trustworthy and simpatico. With me, it goes further. I have always been deeply attracted to just these passages where the writing takes an analytic, interpretive, generalizing turn. They seem to me the dessert, the reward of the prose. I'm going to jump to a later paragraph in the same essay where Lopate is talking about he just doesn't see that kind of reflection or double voicedness in much of his the writing of his students, and he thinks it's partly a result of how they've been instructed. He says the nonfiction students' reluctance to provide summary and analysis shows the markings of that nefarious taboo of writing programs everywhere: show, don't tell. Leaving aside how much this simplistic precept has validity even in fiction, I would argue that literary nonfiction is surely the one area in which it is permissible to tell. In personal essays and memoirs, we must rely on the subjective voice of the first-person narrative to guide us, and if that voice never explains, summarizes, interprets, or provides a larger sociological or historical context for the material, we are in big trouble. So what he's talking not just about double voicedness or having multiple voices within your narrative. Lopate is also talking about reflection. And I think reflection is a key to this genre. We were talking a little bit about Dave Eggers' memoir earlier in the course about a week ago. I would say for me, one of the key weaknesses of Eggers' memoir, although it's a memoir that I very much am very fond of and I think is brilliant, is that it has very little reflection. And I think that's part of Eggers' misunderstanding of the genre, and not really. In some ways, he was writing a memoir in more the way that people typically write fiction. So I would encourage you to think about that reflection. One of the things that I'm reading right now is St. Augustine's Confessions. I'd read parts of it before, but I'd never read the entire work all the way through. And in many ways, St. Augustine is, his Confessions is basically the seminal work for nonfiction. One of the things I've just been struck by is how much of it is reflection. Now, some of that reflection is meditation on religious issues and communing with God and talking to God, but an awful lot of it is reflecting on his personal experience. There's actually a very small amount of personal experience in what many people consider to be the first autobiography in Western civilization. For example, he spends a short paragraph talking about a time when he was a fairly young boy, when he and some of his friends stole pears, stole pears, and so he does a paragraph on what actually happened, and then he spends like about 5 pages reflecting on it. So that gives you some indication of the quantity or the mix of narration and reflection that you find in something like St. Augustine's Confessions. So think about that as you're doing your own work. If you feel like you're managing the discussion boards okay, you can jump off of the video right now. I just wanted to give a tip to people if they feel like they're getting a little bogged down in the discussion boards. I hope that you're using the not read aspect of the discussion boards to manage the volume of what's being posted. So if you look at the discussion board, any one of the discussion boards, over at the right, there's going to be a not read column. It will have a blue button. Within the blue button will be a number like 3, which will tell you that there are 3 posts that you haven't read yet in that discussion board. You can click on that number and it will pull up only the unread posts. So I would try and use this as much as possible. Here's the only problem with doing that. Because if we're reading the unread post, we may lose the context of a reply and what that reply is referring to. So when you make replies to someone else's post, I would strongly encourage you to repeat some of the context in your reply, and then it'll be clearer to the rest of us about what you're replying to. Have a good week. If you have any questions, send me an email.